The Dakota wind in 1887 wasn't just cold. It was a killer. It was the kind of cold that stole the breath from your lungs and turned it into a ghost of ice right before your eyes. In the heart of that frozen hell, a storm the old-timers would later call the White Hurricane was gathering its power, ready to wipe the very memory of man off the map. And in a small, isolated cabin, one woman heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a thin cry, almost lost in the howl of the blizzard, a sound that could have been the wind whistling through a crack in the logs. It could have been a wolf. It could have been her mind, cracked and fraying from loneliness and cold. She had a choice, a simple one. Stay inside by the warmth of the fire, where life was safe, or open the door and step out into a wall of white that promised a quick, frozen death. All for a sound that was probably just nothing. Her hand reached for the latch. What followed would pit a lone widow against a force of nature, an angry town, and a terrible misunderstanding. Her choice would lead her to a secret buried in the snow, a secret so impossible, so unbelievable, that it would bring 100 Lakota warriors to her doorstep, their faces set like stone, their purpose unknown. This is the story of what happens when one small act of courage lights a fuse on the unforgiving frontier. And before we dive in, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to that cabin door. Eleanor Blackwood pressed her ear against the rough-hewn wood of her cabin wall. The blizzard wasn't just a storm, it was a living thing. It screamed and clawed at her home, a monster trying to get in. For 2 years since her husband James had been taken by pneumonia, she'd run this horse ranch, Whispering Pines, on her own. Every day was a fight against the elements, a fight against the doubts of her neighbors, a fight against the crushing loneliness of the prairie. She was a survivor. Survivors don't do stupid things. And opening that door was the stupidest thing she could possibly imagine. But there it was again, higher than the wind, sharper than the shriek of a branch snapping under the weight of ice. It was a cry, a baby's cry. Impossible. The nearest homestead with a child was the Miller place, a good 12 miles away. No one, not even a desperate soul, would be out in this. It was suicide. A person could get lost 10 feet from their own porch, swallowed by the whiteout, frozen solid in minutes. She told herself it was the wind. It had to be the wind. The cry stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. The silence was a scream of its own. It screamed of a life snuffed out, of a final, desperate breath taken in the killing cold. In that moment, something inside Eleanor broke. Reason, logic, self-preservation, they all shattered. She wasn't just a rancher anymore. She wasn't a widow. She was a woman who heard a child in the dark, and the thought of doing nothing was more terrifying than the storm itself. She moved, her body acting before her mind could protest. Wool upon wool. 2 pairs of socks shoved into fur-lined boots. A heavy buffalo coat that smelled of James. She wrapped a thick scarf around her face until only a slit for her eyes remained. She grabbed the emergency lantern, its steady flame a tiny sun in her shaking hand. At the door she paused, tying one end of a long rope to the porch post. An old trapper's trick, her only guarantee she'd find her way back, if she came back at all. Then she opened the door and stepped into the teeth of the hurricane. The cold was a physical punch. It knocked the air from her lungs and froze the tears in her eyes. The wind tore at her, a giant trying to throw her to the ground. Her lantern was nearly useless, a tiny flickering speck of light in an endless, swirling vortex of snow. She couldn't see the barn, just 20 yards away. She couldn't see the ground beneath her feet. There was only the rope, playing out behind her like a fragile thread of hope, and the direction she thought the cry had come from. She leaned into the gale, each step a monumental effort. The snow was already above her knees, a cold, hungry powder that tried to pull her down. 1 step, 2 steps, counting, trying to keep her bearings in a world that had none. 50 yards out, she started to believe she'd made a fatal mistake, that the cry had been a phantom, a cruel trick of the wind, and she was going to die out here for nothing. Then she heard it again. It was weak, a tiny whimper. but it was close. So close. She swept the lantern in a low arc, its light catching on something dark against the white. A bundle, half buried under a fallen pine bough. It looked like a traveler's pack, dropped and abandoned. A wave of disappointment washed over her, so sharp it felt like grief. She had risked everything for a lost bag of supplies. Still she knelt, brushing away the snow that had begun to form a tiny grave. Her lantern light fell on a face. It was a tiny, perfect, copper-skinned face. Lips blue with cold. Eyes sealed shut. A Lakota infant. Eleanor's heart stopped dead in her chest. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of horror. Who would do this? Who could leave a child to die in a blizzard? Maybe their mother or father was nearby, another frozen shape buried in the snow. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled at the deteriorating buffalo hide wrapped around the baby. She had to check for a pulse, for any sign of life. She pulled back the hide, and the world fell away. It wasn't just one child. Huddled together in a desperate, silent plea for warmth were three. Three tiny bodies, triplets. A sight so rare, so impossible, it felt like a dream. Two boys and a girl, no more than 6 months old, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. Her mind couldn't process it. Abandoned? Lost? How could three babies end up here, in the middle of nowhere, in the heart of the worst storm in a generation? There was no time for questions. There was only the cold, and the faint, flickering spark of life she could feel in their tiny necks. Barely there, but there, all three were alive. For now. Without a second thought, Eleanor ripped open her own coat. She gathered all three of them into her arms, pressing their ice-cold bodies against her own, sharing her warmth, her life force, in a desperate gamble against the storm. She rewrapped her heavy coat around them, creating a small human cocoon. With her precious, fragile cargo clutched to her chest, she grabbed the rope and began the agonizing journey back. The wind howled, seeming to rage at her defiance. Every step was a battle. Her legs screamed, her lungs burned, but the tiny, almost imperceptible weight in her arms was all that mattered. The trip back felt like an eternity, but then, through the swirling snow, she saw it, the faint golden glow from her cabin window. Safety. She burst through the door and collapsed onto the floor, a heap of snow, exhaustion, and miracles. And as the warmth of the cabin enveloped them, one of the babies, the smallest boy, let out a tiny, weak whimper. It wasn't a cry of pain, it was a cry of life, and to Eleanor it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She scrambled to her feet, her exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a fierce, primal urgency. She stoked the fire until it roared, turning the small cabin into a sanctuary of heat. Only then did she lay the triplets on her bed, gently unwrapping the frozen, damp hides. Their traditional Lakota clothes, exquisitely made with delicate beadwork, were soaked through, useless against the monster outside. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice a raw prayer. "Just hold on." Her medical skills were the rough and ready kind every homesteader learned out of necessity. But this was different. Hypothermia in infants. She worked on instinct, preparing warm compresses, careful not to make them too hot. She knew a sudden change in temperature could send their tiny bodies into shock. She started with the girl, who seemed the strongest and the larger of the two boys. Their skin was a terrifying, waxy pale, their limbs stiff and unyielding. But as she worked, a touch of pink began to creep back into their cheeks. They were responding. But the smallest boy, he was the one who terrified her. His face still had a bluish, ghostly tint. His breathing was a series of shallow, ragged gasps. He was frighteningly still, his life slipping away right in front of her. "No," she pleaded, rubbing his tiny frozen hands between her own. "You fight. You hear me? You fight." The blizzard outside seemed to double its fury, as if it knew it was losing its prey. The cabin groaned under the assault. It was just her and these three little souls, an island of life in an ocean of death. An hour crawled by, an hour of frantic, focused work, warming compresses, gently massaging limbs, trying to coax a few drops of warm water between their lips. The girl was starting to make small, mewling sounds of hunger. The bigger boy was stirring, but the smallest one, the little fighter, he just lay there. And Eleanor started to feel a cold dread creep into her heart, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm. A heavy fist pounded on the door, making her jump. "Miss Eleanor!" It was Samuel Tucker, her foreman. A good man, weathered and loyal, who'd stayed on after James died. "Everything all right in there? Saw your light." He must have been in the barn, checking the horses. She hesitated for only a second. She couldn't do this alone. "Samuel, I need you. Get in here, quickly." The door swung open, letting in a swirl of snow and brutal cold. Samuel stamped his boots, his gaze falling on the scene before him. His eyes widened, his jaw slackened. The tough, seen-it-all foreman looked at the three tiny babies on Eleanor's bed, and all the hardness in his face just melted away. "Good Lord," he whispered, pulling off his hat. "Where? How?" "No time," Eleanor cut him off, her voice sharp with urgency. "Found them by the creek. This one," she pointed to the smallest boy. "He's not responding. You have to ride to the Wilkerson place. Emily was a midwife. She'll know what to do." Samuel's face creased with worry, the harsh reality of their situation crashing down. "Miss Eleanor, I can't. It's 3 miles. There's zero visibility. I'd be dead before I got halfway." He was right. Sending him out was a death sentence. Her mind raced. "Then you help me here," she commanded, a new plan forming instantly. "We need milk. Goat's milk. Warm." Without a word, Samuel turned and plunged back into the storm, heading for the small pen where they kept 2 goats. While he was gone, Eleanor refused to give up on the little one. She held him close, whispering to him, pouring all of her hope, all of her will, into his tiny, still body. And then he took a breath. A real one, deep and shuddering. His little chest rose and fell in a way it hadn't before. Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes, hot and surprising. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her own breath, waiting. Just then, Samuel returned, a small pail of steaming goat's milk in his hand. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. Eleanor fashioned a makeshift wick from a clean cloth and began to feed the girl, who suckled with a surprising strength. The bigger boy was just as eager, but when she tried to feed the smallest one, he could only manage a few drops before his eyes fluttered shut. It wasn't the deathly stillness from before, though. This was sleep. Real, natural sleep. He was exhausted, but he was alive. As the immediate crisis passed, the terrifying questions came rushing back in. "Who would do this?" Samuel finally asked, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Just leave them out there to die? And triplets? It's unnatural." "We don't know they were abandoned," Eleanor said, though even she didn't fully believe it. Their parents could be out there still. The thought was a chilling one. Any adult caught in this storm for that long, their chances were zero. The blizzard raged for another 2 days, locking them inside the cabin. Eleanor and Samuel fell into a routine. Feed, warm, change, repeat. The world shrank to the size of that small room and the 3 lives that depended on them. They needed names. It felt wrong to just call them the boys and the girl. "This little fighter," Eleanor said, rocking the smallest one. "He reminds me of my grandfather. We'll call him William." She looked at the other 2, sleeping soundly now. "The big one can be George, and her," a sad smile touched her lips. "Her name is Grace. William, George, and Grace." As if hearing his name, little William opened his eyes. And for the first time, he looked right at Eleanor, not with the vacant stare of an infant, but with a deep, knowing intelligence that shook her to her core. It was a connection, instant, unbreakable. "Welcome back, William," she whispered. "You're safe now." But as the storm outside finally began to quiet down, a new one was just beginning to brew. Because these weren't just any children. They were Lakota children. And on the Dakota frontier, in a world full of suspicion and old wounds, saving them might have been the easy part. The real danger was just beginning. When the sun finally broke through, the world was silent, buried under mountains of snow. It wasn't long before her other two ranch hands, Matthew and Daniel, made their way from the bunkhouse. The look on their faces when they saw the three babies was a picture of pure shock. But that shock quickly turned to a deep, frontier-bred worry. "Word's gonna spread," Daniel warned, his face grim. "The mail riders due through tomorrow. Once he sees them, the whole territory will know by the end of the week." "And then what?" Matthew, the youngest, asked nervously. "They're people. They might come looking." Eleanor looked at the makeshift crib she'd made from a wooden crate, where the three babies slept. "I hope they do," she said, her voice firm. "They deserve to be with their family." But the men exchanged a look that said she didn't understand. Their people coming looking wasn't a social call. In this part of the country, it could mean trouble, the kind of trouble that ends in fire and bloodshed. An uneasy peace existed between the settlers and the Lakota, but it was a peace built on distance and mistrust. Old wounds from the wars of the last decade ran deep. To the other homesteaders, Eleanor wasn't just saving three children. She was inviting danger to their doorstep. She was breaking an unwritten rule. And the frontier had its own way of dealing with rule breakers. That afternoon, she sent Daniel to fetch Emily Wilkerson, the midwife, deliberately leaving out the part about the babies being Lakota. She needed medical advice, not a political debate. While he was gone, she focused on William. He was stable, but he was weak, a fragile little bird. She found herself holding him more than the others, whispering words of encouragement, willing him to be strong. A bond was forming, a fierce, protective love that scared her. Emily Wilkerson arrived, a practical, no-nonsense woman whose face didn't register judgment, only a professional curiosity. She examined Grace and George quickly. "These two are strong," she declared. "You did good work, Eleanor. Saved their lives." But when she turned to William, her expression grew serious. She listened to his chest with her stethoscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "There's a crackle in his lungs," Emily said, her voice low. "The cold, it's settled in his chest. It's the beginning of pneumonia." The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Pneumonia was what had taken her husband. It was a killer, swift and merciless. Emily left her with some willow bark extract for the fever and a mustard plaster. But her parting words were what truly chilled Eleanor to the bone. "Be careful, Eleanor," she said, hesitating at the door. "There's talk in town. A Lakota war party was spotted near Thunder Basin just before the storm hit. They were looking for something. Or someone." A war party. The pieces started to click together in a terrifying way. They hadn't been abandoned. They'd been lost. Lost by a group of warriors who were now, almost certainly, still searching. After Emily left, Samuel found something else. Tracks, preserved in the ice under the new snow, just at the edge of their property. Unshod ponies. Lakota. Not just passing through. They were circling, searching in a pattern. A desperate, systematic search that had been cut short by the blizzard. This changed everything. These weren't just three orphans. They were the children of important people, people with the means to launch a serious search. And right now, those people probably thought their children were dead. Or worse, they might think they'd been stolen. A misunderstanding like that on the frontier. It didn't just lead to trouble. It led to massacres. "We have to let them know," Eleanor declared, a wild plan forming in her mind. "We have to signal them. Let them know the children are safe." Samuel looked at her like she was insane. "Signal them? Miss Eleanor, that's like putting up a sign that says, 'Come get shot at.' We don't know who they are or what they want." But Eleanor's mind was made up. Fear wasn't going to rule her. She thought of a story James had told her, about a Lakota hunter who had given him 3 eagle feathers as a gift of respect. The next day, she and Samuel rode to the highest ridge on her property. They found the tallest pine tree and, with numb fingers, tied the 3 eagle feathers to its highest branch, bound with a strip of red cloth. A sign, a message she could only pray they would understand. 3 lives found. Safe. Here. But as she stood there, watching the feathers flutter in the wind, she couldn't shake a terrible feeling. Was she sending a message of peace? Or had she just lit a beacon, calling down a storm far more dangerous than the one she had just survived? The days that followed were a blur of nervous tension. The signal on the ridge remained untouched, but they weren't alone. At night they heard it, the howl of wolves, except it wasn't wolves. Lakota scouts, Samuel said, his voice a low whisper as they stood by the cabin window, peering into the darkness. Using wolf calls to talk to each other across the valley. They're out there. They're watching us. The thought of unseen eyes in the darkness, judging her every move, sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Were they seen as a savior or a kidnapper? Then William took a turn for the worse. His fever spiked. A harsh, wet cough racked his tiny body, leaving him exhausted and gasping for breath. Emily Wilkerson came again, her face etched with worry. "The infection is deep," she said gravely. "He needs a real doctor, Eleanor, and the circuit doctor isn't due for 2 more weeks." 2 weeks. Eleanor knew, with a sickening certainty, that William didn't have 2 weeks. He didn't even have 2 days. She looked at his flushed face, at the way his little chest struggled for every breath, and a desperate idea took hold. An idea that went against every rule of the frontier. "Lakota medicine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, have you ever heard if it works?" Emily looked shocked, but she considered it seriously. "I've heard stories," she admitted. "Army doctors who saw them treat lung sickness with a kind of steam inhalation. Herbs. Something they call purple coneflower. They said it worked when nothing else would." That was all Eleanor needed to hear. Pride, fear, the opinions of her neighbors. None of it mattered. Only William mattered. "We have to ask for their help," she told Samuel. "We have to invite them in." This time Samuel didn't argue. He saw the desperation in her eyes, heard the death rattle in William's chest. Eleanor sent Daniel back to the ridge. "Build a small fire," she instructed, "one that makes smoke, and add a 4th feather to the signal, a white one. An invitation, a plea for a truce. Come, we need your help." A tense afternoon passed. Then, just as the sun began to set, Daniel returned, his eyes wide. "I saw one," he said, breathing hard. "A lone rider on the far ridge. He watched me for a long time. Then," he raised his hand, "a signal. And then I heard the wolf calls again. A different pattern this time. A response. They were coming." That night the weight was unbearable. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made them jump. William's breathing grew shallower, more labored. Eleanor paced the floor with him, rocking him, whispering to him, her heart breaking with every cough. Just after midnight, when all hope seemed lost, it came. 3 sharp, distinct knocks on the door. Not the frantic pounding of a lost traveler. This was measured, deliberate, confident. Samuel grabbed his rifle, but Eleanor shook her head. She nodded for him to open the door, her own arms tightening around William. The door swung open. Standing in the moonlight was a Lakota woman. She was tall, regal, her face a mask of stoic calm. Her dress was adorned with intricate beadwork that shimmered in the lantern light. Behind her, 2 warriors sat motionless on their horses, like statues carved from the night itself. The woman's dark eyes ignored Samuel, locking directly onto Eleanor and the sick child in her arms. Her voice when she spoke was clear, perfect English, with an authority that was absolute. "I am Morning Star," she announced. "I have come for the children of Black Elk." Eleanor didn't feel fear. All she felt was a flicker of hope. "This child is dying," she said, her voice cracking. "He needs help. Your help." Morning Star's gaze shifted to William, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. A deep, profound sadness. "The smallest one always walks the hardest path," she said, stepping across the threshold without waiting for an invitation. She moved past Samuel as if he wasn't there, her purpose clear, her focus absolute. She was here to heal, and Eleanor knew, in that moment, that this woman was William's last and only chance. Morning Star was a healer. There was no other word for it. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. She barely glanced at the willow bark and mustard plasters Emily had left. Instead, she sent one of her warriors to fetch a bundle from his horse. Inside was an array of dried herbs, roots, and powdered substances that filled the cabin with the scent of pine and earth and something else. Something ancient. "He is the son of your chief?" Eleanor asked as Morningstar began mixing ingredients in a small copper pot. "Black Elk is his father?" Morningstar paused, her dark eyes studying Eleanor, seeming to weigh her worth. "Black Elk is chief of our band," she confirmed. "His wife, White Feather, walked the spirit road the day she brought these three into the world." The story tumbled out, a tragedy whispered in the quiet of the cabin. The triplets, a rare and powerful blessing, were being taken to their aunt when the blizzard hit, separating the party. They had found the frozen bodies of the aunt and a warrior 2 days ago. The other warrior had survived, but the cold had broken his mind. These children weren't just lost. They were the orphaned, high-born sons and daughter of a chief, survivors of a terrible tragedy. As Morningstar worked, she began to sing, a low, melodic chant that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the cabin. It was a song of healing, of power, of a connection to the world that Eleanor had never known. She created a small tent of blankets over William, placing the steaming pot of herbs inside. "He will breathe the spirit of the plants," as she explained. "It will chase the water from his lungs." For an hour they waited. The only sounds were Morningstar's soft chanting and the ragged sound of William's breathing. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the breathing began to change. The harsh, wet rattle softened. The frantic gasps eased into a deeper, more regular rhythm. When Morningstar finally lifted the blanket, William was sleeping peacefully, his face no longer flushed with fever, but calm. A sheen of sweat covered his forehead. The fever had broken. Relief washed over Eleanor so intensely, her knees went weak. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. Morningstar looked at her, a flicker of a smile in her eyes. "His spirit is strong, and you care for them as if they were your own blood." The statement hung in the air. It was true. In the space of a few days, these children had burrowed their way into a part of her heart she thought had died with James. Then came the words that brought the cold back into the room. "Black Elk will want to thank you himself," Morningstar said. "He rides with the rest of our people. They are 2 days behind me." The implications were staggering. Not just a few warriors, but the entire band. 20 lodges. That could be 100 people. 100 Lakota, including warriors, heading directly for her ranch. Directly towards the town of Miller's Creek, where fear and suspicion were already simmering. "Your neighbors will not see this as a social call," Morningstar observed, seeming to read Eleanor's mind. Just as the reality of the situation was sinking in, they heard riders. 4 of them, coming fast up the main road. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. Morningstar moved to the window. "Armed men," she said, her voice flat, devoid of surprise. "Looking for trouble." Eleanor recognized the man in the lead. Jeremiah Foster, a hard man from a nearby ranch, a man known for his deep-seated hatred of all native people, a man who saw the world in black and white, settlers and savages. "Stay inside," Eleanor ordered, pulling on her coat. "I'll handle this." She stepped out onto the porch, into the crisp morning air, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was standing between two worlds. Inside her cabin was a Lakota medicine woman and the 3 infant children of a chief. In her yard were 4 armed and angry settlers, their faces grim, their rifles held loosely but ready. The fragile peace of the frontier was about to be shattered, and she was standing right at the epicenter. "Morning, Jeremiah," Eleanor said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear churning in her stomach. Foster didn't bother with pleasantries. "We heard you had company," he said, his eyes hard as flint, sweeping past her to the cabin door. "Indian company." Word had traveled faster than she'd thought. The story was out. "I found 3 children in the storm, Jeremiah. Lakota children. I've been keeping them safe until their family could be found." "Harboring them, you mean?" Another man spat. "You know the rules, Eleanor. You're putting us all at risk." Foster dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, an act of intimidation. "It's not just about the babies anymore. Richardson at the trading post says there's a war party gathering. 20 lodges heading this way. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. You brought them here. You invited this danger to our homes. It's not a war party, Eleanor insisted, her voice rising. It's a father coming for his children. His name is Black Elk. He's a chief. He's coming in peace. Foster just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. There's no such thing as a peaceful Indian, not in those numbers. I've called a meeting. Miller's Creek, noon. Every man with a rifle is coming. We're forming a militia. A militia. The word hung in the cold air, thick with the promise of violence. This was escalating into a nightmare. They weren't just afraid. They wanted this. Foster and his kind, they'd been waiting for an excuse to finish the war they felt the army had left undone. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The mistake, he whispered, was bringing them inside your house. Some folks might even say that's treason. Before Eleanor could even process the threat, Morningstar was gone. She'd slipped out the back while Foster was distracted, riding hard to warn Black Elk. The men who look for conflict will always find a reason to create it, she'd said before she left. Now Eleanor was alone with the children, a militia forming in town, and 100 Lakota on their way. She had to go to that meeting. She had to try and talk some sense into them. Miller's Creek was buzzing like a hornet's nest. The saloon was packed with grim-faced men, their rifles leaning against the wall. When Eleanor walked in, the room fell silent. She stood before them, a lone woman in a sea of angry, frightened men, and she told them the truth. She spoke of 3 babies, blue with cold. She spoke of a father, a chief coming to bring them home. He comes in peace, she pleaded. An armed response will only provoke the very bloodshed you say you want to prevent. Foster just sneered. And we're supposed to take the word of a woman who's been keeping company with savages? The room erupted. It was no use. Their fear was a wall she couldn't break through. Just when it seemed violence was inevitable, a new voice cut through the noise. Sheriff Landry, a fair man, a former Army scout who knew the Lakota better than most. That's enough, he boomed. There will be no militia. I'll ride back with Mrs. Blackwood and assess the situation myself. The rest of you will go home. Foster was furious, but he couldn't openly defy the law. As Eleanor and the sheriff rode back to her ranch, however, they saw Foster and his men gathering, talking in low, angry tones. They weren't going home. They were just waiting for their moment. Back at the cabin, things got worse. Daniel reported that Foster's men had been spotted on the ridges, watching the house, scouting. They were treating her like an enemy outpost. That evening, Morningstar returned, her face grim. She had reached Black Elk. He understood the danger. He was changing his plan. But then, as darkness fell, Samuel shouted from the porch, "Riders coming! 12 of them! It's Foster!" They were done waiting. They were forcing a confrontation. Sheriff Landry stepped onto the porch, his hand on his gun. "Stay inside, Eleanor," he commanded. "This is official business now." Through the window, Eleanor watched the tense standoff. Foster, emboldened by his numbers, was accusing the sheriff of being an Indian lover. The situation was a powder keg, and Foster was holding a lit match. Just as rifles were starting to be raised, a lone rider came galloping out of the darkness from the east, a young Lakota warrior. He rode straight into the middle of the standoff, ignoring the guns, and spoke rapidly to Morningstar. She turned, her face calm, and made an announcement that changed everything. "Black Elk has heard the warnings," she said, her voice carrying across the tense yard. "He has sent his family, the women and children, back. He approaches now, but not with a war party. He comes with only his 12 council elders. He comes in peace to prove his intentions are honorable." The wind went out of Foster's sails. His narrative of a savage invasion was crumbling. 12 men, mostly elders, was not a war party. His own men started to look at each other, their certainty wavering. They agreed to pull back to the ridge and watch. A fragile truce had been bought. As the first light of dawn broke across the snow, Eleanor saw them, 12 riders, moving slowly, with dignity. In the lead was a man who could only be the chief, Black Elk. He was tall, his face a history of sorrow and strength. He dismounted and walked towards her, his eyes finding hers. Then his gaze dropped to the three bundles in her and Samuel's arms. For the first time, the chief's stoic mask crumbled, replaced by a look of pure, unshielded love and relief. "I am Black Elk," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have saved my children." Eleanor carefully handed him William. The chief took his smallest son, his hand surprisingly gentle, and whispered to him in Lakota. A father's prayer, a blessing. He took each of his children in turn, a sacred, silent reunion playing out in the cold morning air. Foster's men watched from the ridge, silent. It was impossible to see this and still see a savage. This was a man, a father. "My people owe you a debt that can never be repaid," Black Elk said, turning back to Eleanor. "But we must honor it." He raised his hand, and then Eleanor's blood ran cold. From behind the eastern ridges, riders appeared. Dozens of them. Then more, and more. They poured over the hills, a silent, endless river of warriors on horseback. Foster's men scrambled for their rifles. Sheriff Landry drew his gun. This was it. A trap. A trick. But the warriors weren't charging. They carried no weapons. They formed a great silent circle around the ranch, their faces solemn. There were 100 of them. "I promised only 12 would approach your home," Black Elk explained, his voice calm amidst the sudden tension. "But tradition demands our entire nation bear witness when a great honor is given." This wasn't an army. It was an honor guard, the ultimate sign of respect. He stepped forward. "For your courage, for your compassion, from this day forward, you will be known among the Lakota as Wikapi Waste Wind, the Good Star Woman. This land, your home, is under the protection of my people. No harm will ever come to you here." Elders came forward with gifts, a sacred pipe, a ceremonial blanket, a beaded cradleboard. And then, the 100 warriors began to sing. A song of honor, a song of gratitude that echoed across the valley. A sound so beautiful it brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She had faced down a blizzard, a mob, and the threat of a war, all for 3 little lives. And in return, she hadn't just saved them. She had built a bridge. In the heart of a land torn apart by hatred and fear, she had created a small, protected island of peace. The children went home with their father, but every spring, like clockwork, Black Elk would return with them. William, George, and Grace would spend a day at the ranch with the Good Star Woman who had walked into a storm to give them back their lives. She had chosen to open a door, and in doing so had opened a door between 2 worlds. What an incredible story of courage and compassion. It just goes to show you that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most profound rewards. If you enjoyed this story, I've got 2 more picked out just for you, right there on the screen. I have a feeling you're going to love them. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It's the best way to make sure you never miss another journey into the past. Thanks for watching.